The shuttle descended through the blackness of dead space, and General Ilara Vasquez pressed her forehead against the cold viewport glass and watched Nexus Station grow from a speck of light into a massive ring of metal and glass, spinning slowly around a star that had burned out 1,000,000 years ago. She was 58 years old, and her dark hair had turned silver at the temples, and there were lines around her eyes that told the story of decades spent sitting across tables from creatures who could crush a human skull with one hand and smiling at them anyway, and finding the words that kept the guns silent for one more year. 900 years of silence between humanity and the hegemony of United Worlds, and she had spent 30 of those years making sure that silence held. Ambassador Cale Morrow sat across from her in the shuttle cabin, and he was young and his uniform was too crisp, and his eyes were full of the kind of hope that made Vasquez feel both proud and afraid, because she remembered when she had eyes like that, and she remembered what the galaxy had done to that hope over the decades. "General," Morrow said quietly, "do you really think they will accept the alliance proposal?" Vasquez turned from the viewport and studied him for a moment, and then she said, "I think that people who have been afraid of each other for 900 years do not stop being afraid because someone hands them a piece of paper, but I think the paper matters because it gives them permission to try." Morrow nodded and looked down at his hands, and Vasquez could see that he wanted to believe her, and she wanted to believe herself. The shuttle docked with a gentle shudder, and the airlock hissed open, and the smell of Nexus Station hit them immediately. And it was the smell of 100 different species crammed into one place, and recycled air and ozone, and something faintly sweet that the Velkari exuded when they were nervous. Vasquez stepped onto the station, and her boots rang against the metal floor, and she felt the weight of what she carried. And it was not just the datapad in her hand with the alliance proposal, but the weight of every human being alive. Because if this worked, then their grandchildren would grow up in a galaxy without borders. And if it failed, then she did not want to think about what came next. The Hegemony Honor Guard was waiting for them, and they were tall insectoid soldiers with gleaming black carapaces and plasma rifles held across their chests, and their compound eyes tracked Vasquez as she walked past them, and she noticed that there were twice as many guards as protocol required. She filed that away in the back of her mind. High Sovereign Thalvexis had sent his personal adjutant to greet them, and the adjutant was a thin, trembling creature who spoke in rapid clicks that the translator in Vasquez's ear turned into flat monotone English, and the adjutant said that the sovereign was honored by humanity's presence, and that the reaffirmation ceremony would proceed as planned, and that all preparations had been made for a historic occasion. Vasquez smiled and thanked the adjutant and said all the right words, but her eyes were moving, and she was counting guards and nodding camera positions, and watching the way the hegemony officers whispered to each other when they thought she was not looking. Something was wrong. She could feel it the way a sailor feels a storm before the clouds appear, and it was in the air, and in the way the station hummed, and in the too quick smiles of the hegemony diplomats. She had survived 30 years in galactic politics by trusting that feeling. Their quarters were spacious and overlooked the central atrium, where the ceremony would take place the next day, and Vasquez stood at the window and looked down at the vast circular chamber, where 900 years ago the first human and the first hegemony sovereign had pressed their respective appendages to the concordance of silence and ended a war that had killed billions. The First Contact War had lasted only 11 years, but it had burned itself into the memory of every species in the galaxy, because humanity had been outnumbered 1,000 to 1, and they had no allies and no faster-than-light travel when it started, and they had fought the entire hegemony to a standstill through sheer stubborn fury and ingenuity, and a willingness to sacrifice that the alien species had never encountered before. The hegemony had expected to crush humanity in weeks, and instead the war had dragged on for over a decade, and the cost had been so terrible on both sides that, when the ceasefire came, Both civilizations had simply stopped and stared at each other across the rubble, and agreed that this could never happen again. That was the concordance of silence, and for 900 years it had held. But Vasquez knew that peace was not a thing you achieved once and then forgot about, and peace was a living creature that needed to be fed every single day, and she had fed it her entire life. And now, she had come to Nexus Station with the biggest meal she had ever prepared. The Alliance proposal would transform the Concordance from a simple non-aggression pact into a full partnership, and human space would open to hegemony citizens and hegemony space would open to humans, and there would be shared research and shared trade and shared defense. And for the first time in 900 years, the two greatest powers in the galaxy would stand together, instead of apart. It was the dream of her life. Morrow knocked on her door and she let him in, and he was carrying a tablet with intelligence reports, and his face had changed, and the hope in his eyes had been joined by something darker. "General," he said, "our listening posts have picked up unusual fleet movements along the border, and 3 hegemony battle groups have repositioned in the last 48 hours, and there is no scheduled exercise that would explain it." Vasquez took the tablet and scrolled through the data, and her jaw tightened. "Who authorized the repositioning?" she asked. "The orders trace back to War Admiral Drethka," Morrow said. Vasquez closed her eyes for a moment, and Drethka was the name she had hoped not to hear, because she knew him and she had sat across from him at a dozen negotiation tables, and he was a hegemony military hardliner who believed that the Concordance was a mistake, and that humanity should have been exterminated 900 years ago when they had the chance. He was old and bitter and dangerous, and he had spent decades whispering in the ears of anyone who would listen that humans were vermin who bred too fast and spread too far, and that one day they would swallow the galaxy whole if the hegemony did not act first. "What about the sovereign?" Vasquez asked. "Is Thalvexis aware of the movements?" "We cannot confirm," Morrow said. "Our sources inside the hegemony court have gone silent in the last week." Vasquez set the tablet down and walked to the window again and stared out at the dead star that Nexus Station orbited, and she thought about how fitting it was that they had built a place of peace around something that had already died. "Send an encrypted pulse to Terran High Command," she said, and her voice was calm and steady the way it always was when things were about to go very wrong. Authorization code Iron Dove, and message reads as follows: "And something has changed, and prepare for contingency Iron Dawn." Morrow stared at her, and she could see the question in his eyes, and Iron Dawn was a code he had heard about only in whispers, and it was the contingency that was never supposed to be activated, and it meant that the Concordance was at risk of collapse. "General," he said, "are you sure?" "No," Vasquez said, "and that is exactly why I am sending it, because if I am wrong then we have lost nothing, but if I am right and I do not send it then we have lost everything." She turned back to the window, and below her, the atrium was being decorated for the ceremony, and workers were hanging banners in the colors of both civilizations, and setting up the podium where she would stand tomorrow and present the Alliance proposal to the galaxy. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the datapad with her speech, and she read the final line one more time, and it said that humanity did not come to this station as conquerors or as supplicants, but as neighbors who had lived beside the hegemony for 9 centuries, and who wanted nothing more than to finally open the door between them. She whispered to Morrow, "If they accept this, then our grandchildren will grow up in a galaxy without borders." Then she set the datapad down and dimmed the lights and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come because her gut was screaming at her that tomorrow would not go the way she hoped, and she lay in the darkness of a station orbiting a dead star and listened to the hum of the metal walls and waited for the morning. She did not know that it would be her last night alive. The Grand A. Triumph of Nexus Station was the largest enclosed space ever built by any species in the galaxy, and it could hold 10,000 beings, and on that morning every seat was filled. Delegates from 12,000 hegemony worlds sat in their designated sections, and their carapaces and scales and feathers and skin of every color caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers that hung from the domed ceiling 300 meters above, and the air hummed with the sound of 100 different languages being whispered at once. The Valkyrie delegation sat near the front, and they were tall and willowy with skin like pale marble, and 4 arms folded in the formal posture of respect, and the Orusians were beside them, and they were squat and heavy, with deep-set eyes that glowed faintly orange, and the Den were in the back rows because they preferred high ground by instinct, and they were covered in short dark fur, and their teeth were visible even when their mouths were closed. And then there were the humans, and the Terran delegation was small, because humanity had always sent small delegations to Nexus Station as a gesture of trust, and they sat in a cluster near the center aisle, and Ambassador Kale Morrow was among them, and his hands were clenched in his lap. Every major network in the galaxy was broadcasting live, and billions upon billions of sentient beings on thousands of worlds were watching their screens and waiting. General Ilara Vasquez walked to the podium. She wore her dress uniform, and it was dark blue with silver trim, and her medals caught the light, and there were many of them, but she had never cared about medals, and she carried her datapad in her left hand, and she set it on the podium and looked out at the assembled galaxy, and she took one slow breath. 900 years ago, she began, and her voice was carried by amplifiers to every corner of the atrium, and to every screen on every world. 2 civilizations stood in the ashes of a war that should never have been fought, and they looked at each other, and they made a choice, and that choice was silence. The atrium was so quiet that Morrow could hear his own heartbeat. Silence was the right choice, Vasquez continued, because when you do not know how to speak to someone, and when the only words you have are words of anger and grief, then silence is better than war, but silence is not peace, and silence is not friendship, and silence is not a future. She paused and looked directly at the hegemony section, and her eyes found the empty throne where High Sovereign Thalvexis was watching through a holographic relay from his private chamber, because he was too old and too frail to attend in person. Humanity did not come to this station as conquerors, she said, and we did not come as supplicants, and we came as neighbors who have lived beside you for 9 centuries, and who are tired of silence. In the upper galleries of the atrium, a figure shifted in the shadows, and it was a sharp-scale assassin, and it was one of the hegemony's deadliest breeds of engineered killers, and it had been positioned there 6 hours before the ceremony began under orders that came directly from War Admiral Drethka. The assassin's rifle was a long-barreled plasma weapon designed to fire a single bolt at a precise target from extreme range, and it made almost no sound, and it left almost no trace, and the assassin had its crosshairs fixed on the center of Vasquez's chest. Vasquez lifted her datapad and smiled, and it was a real smile and not a politician's smile, and she said, "I carry with me today a proposal from the Terran Confederation, and it is not a demand, and it is not a threat, and it is an invitation." She began to read the terms of the alliance, and her voice was steady and warm, and she spoke of open borders and shared research and mutual defense and cultural exchange, and she spoke of human children learning Valkyrie music and Orusian children studying human literature and Den warriors training beside Terran Marines, and she painted a picture of a galaxy that was not divided by fear, but connected by curiosity. Several Valkyrie delegates were visibly moved, and their skin had shifted to the deep blue that indicated profound emotion, and even some of the hegemony military officers in attendance had lowered their rigid posture. In his private chamber, War Admiral Drethka watched the broadcast, and his mandibles clicked in fury, because he could see that the speech was working, and he could see the faces changing in the crowd, and he could feel the narrative slipping away from him, and he gave the signal. The assassin fired. The plasma bolt crossed the atrium in less than a heartbeat, and it struck General Ilara Vasquez in the center of her chest, and the impact threw her backward and her datapad flew from her hand and clattered across the stage and she fell. The sound that followed was not a scream, and it was not a gasp, and it was a silence so total and so absolute that it seemed to swallow the entire station. Then Morrow was running, and he reached her in seconds, and he dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms, and her uniform was burned through, and the wound beneath it was terrible, and her eyes were open, and she was looking at him, and her mouth moved but no words came out. She died in his arms on live broadcast, while the galaxy watched. For 3 seconds nothing happened, and the atrium was frozen, and 10,000 beings stared at the stage, and billions more stared at their screens, and the galaxy held its breath. Then War Admiral Drethka's voice thundered through the station's communication system, and he declared that General Vasquez had been carrying not an alliance proposal, but a declaration of war, and that humanity had been planning the destruction of the hegemony for decades, and that the concordance of silence was dissolved effective immediately. It was a lie, and every word of it was a lie, but Drethka had spent years preparing this moment, and his fabricated evidence was already being transmitted to every hegemony world, and his prepositioned fleet was already moving toward human border colonies. In his private chamber, High Sovereign Thalvexis sat trembling and confused, and the drugs that Drethka's physicians had been feeding him for months made the world swim and blur. And when Drethka's officers placed the dissolution order before him, he signed it because he could not think clearly enough to refuse. The concordance of silence was dead. Across human space, the news spread like wildfire, and on Earth in the great parliamentary chamber in New Geneva, the representatives of the Terran Confederation watched the footage of Vasquez falling, and the chamber erupted into chaos, and then it went quiet. And the quiet was worse than the shouting, because it was the quiet of a people who had just watched their best hope for peace murdered on a stage. The Terran president stood, and she was a small woman with gray eyes, and she waited until every eye was on her, and then she spoke one sentence. "Wake the wolves." Those 2 words were transmitted to every Terran military installation in every system, and to every ship and every base and every outpost and every listening station, and they were words that had existed in Terran military doctrine for 900 years, and they had never once been spoken aloud by a sitting president. On 1,000 worlds, human soldiers heard those words and stopped what they were doing and looked at each other, and something changed in their eyes, and it was not rage exactly, and it was not hatred, and it was something older and deeper and colder. The galaxy had made a terrible mistake, and it had confused humanity's patience for weakness, and it had confused their restraint for fear, and it had looked at 900 years of peace, and thought that humans had been tamed. But humans had never been tamed, and the peace had not been a cage, and it had been a choice, and General Vasquez had been the living symbol of that choice. And now she was dead on the floor of Nexus Station, with a hole burned through her heart. And the choice died with her. Morrow still knelt on the stage, and he was holding her body, and his hands were covered in her blood, and the cameras were still broadcasting, and the whole galaxy could see him, and he looked up and directly into the nearest camera, and his face was not the face of the young, idealistic diplomat who had boarded the shuttle yesterday. It was something else entirely. He did not say a word, and he did not need to, because his eyes said everything, and what they said was that humanity had come to this station with open hands, and the galaxy had answered with murder, and now the galaxy was going to find out what happened when humanity closed its hands into fists. Across the hegemony, the subject species watched the unedited footage, and the Velkari matriarch saw a woman of peace shot down mid-sentence, and she placed her 4 hands flat on her council table and said nothing for a long time, and then she recalled her fleet from Hegemony Command. The Orusian High Council demanded an explanation that Drethka could not provide without revealing his lies. The Den Warchief watched the footage 3 times, and then he stood and drew his ceremonial blade, and drove it into the wall of his chamber, which in Den culture was a declaration that someone's honor had been fatally stained. The galaxy was cracking, and the cracks ran along the lines that Drethka had never bothered to notice, because he had been so focused on destroying humanity that he forgot the other species were watching too. And they had all seen the same thing. A woman came offering peace, and an empire shot her dead for it. In the dark spaces between stars where no light reached and no sensor could penetrate, there was a stirring that the galaxy had never felt before. It began as a whisper in the void, and then it became a hum, and then it became a roar as millions of ships woke from a sleep that had lasted centuries, and their reactors ignited one by one like matches being struck in an endless dark room, and their hulls shed the dust of ages, and their weapon systems came online with a sound like bones cracking. This was Iron Dawn. For 900 years humanity had honored the concordance of silence, and they had not built planet crackers, and they had not assembled invasion fleets in violation of the treaty. But they had done something that no other species had ever considered, because no other species thought the way humans thought. They had prepared for the day the peace would fail. Not with weapons of destruction, but with weapons of precision, and the ghost fleets were not designed to burn worlds, and they were designed to disable and dismantle, and surgically remove an enemy's ability to fight, and every ship was autonomous, and every ship was connected to every other ship through a quantum network that allowed them to coordinate across thousands of light years in real time. Admiral Jonah Richter stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the tactical display bloom with new signatures as the ghost fleets reported in, and the numbers climbed, and they climbed past 1 million, and then past 2 million, and then past 5 million, and the bridge crew stared at their screens in silence, because even they had not known the full scale of what humanity had built in the darkness. Richter was 60 years old, and his face was carved from stone, and his left eye was artificial, because he had lost the original one in a border skirmish 20 years ago, and he had been Vasquez's student and her protege and the closest thing she had to a son. And when he had watched her die on the broadcast, something inside him had broken, and something else had taken its place. He did not weep, and he did not rage, and he simply stood very still for a long time, and then he began giving orders, and his voice was flat and calm and precise, and every officer on the bridge obeyed instantly, because they could hear in that calm voice the sound of a man who had channeled his grief into something far more dangerous than anger. The hegemony's first strike came 48 hours after Vasquez's assassination, and 3 hegemony battle groups hit human border colonies simultaneously, and they expected to find soft targets and frightened civilians and quick victories that would demoralize the Terran Confederation. They found something else entirely. The colony world of New Carthage was the first to be attacked, and 20 hegemony warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in orbit and began their assault, and they expected the colony's defenses to crumble in minutes, but instead the ground opened up. Deep bunker defense grids that had been buried beneath the colony's surface for generations activated, and anti-orbital batteries rose from hidden silos and began firing, and the colonists themselves did not flee, and they did not panic, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had been quietly training for this exact scenario their entire lives. Every human colony had these preparations, and every human colony had conducted drills disguised as cultural festivals and community exercises, and every human adult knew how to operate basic military equipment, and how to coordinate with their neighbors, and how to make an invading force pay for every meter of ground. The hegemony took New Carthage after 3 days of fighting, but they lost 6 warships and 4,000 soldiers to take a colony of 12,000 civilians, and the cost was so staggering that the fleet commander sent a bewildered report to Drethka asking if he had accidentally attacked a military installation. He had not, and that was just what human civilians looked like when someone threatened their homes. Across the border the story repeated itself, and every colony fought, and every colony extracted a terrible price, and the hegemony's advance slowed to a crawl as commanders realized that there was no such thing as an easy target in human space. Meanwhile, Ambassador Morrow had refused evacuation from Nexus Station, and he had disappeared into the station's maintenance tunnels with a small team of Terran intelligence operatives, and they had found a hidden relay station, and Morrow began broadcasting. He played the unedited footage of Vasquez's assassination on every frequency he could reach, and he played it on hegemony military channels and civilian channels and diplomatic channels, and he played it on loop without commentary, because the footage needed no commentary. The galaxy saw a woman standing at a podium talking about peace, and then the galaxy saw her chest explode, and the galaxy saw her fall, and the galaxy saw a young man holding her body, and the galaxy drew its own conclusions. The Velkari matriarchy formally withdrew its fleet contributions from the hegemony war effort within a week, and the matriarch released a public statement calling the assassination an act of dishonor that stained the hegemony's legacy, and she demanded an independent investigation. The Orusians followed 3 days later, and their High Council had analyzed Drethka's so-called evidence of human warmongering, and found it full of fabrications, and they published their findings, and the cracks in the hegemony widened. The Den Warchief went further, and he appeared on a public broadcast and declared that Drethka had committed what the Den called a shamming of the hunt, which meant that he had killed prey that was not fighting, and in Den culture, this was the lowest possible act, and the Warchief announced that any Den warrior who continued to serve under Drethka's command would be stripped of their honor marks. Drethka raged and threatened, and demanded loyalty, but the empire he had tried to unite against humanity was fracturing beneath his feet. And then something happened that terrified the galaxy even more than humanity's military response. The ghost fleets engaged the hegemony, and they were devastating, and they cut through hegemony battle lines like blades through cloth. But they did not do what everyone expected, and they did not bomb hegemony worlds, and they did not target civilian populations, and they did not burn cities or poison atmospheres or crack continents. They were surgical and precise beyond anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, and they disabled weapons platforms, and destroyed shipyards and severed supply lines, and knocked out communication arrays, and they did all of this without killing a single civilian. Admiral Richter had issued standing orders to every Terran commander, and the orders were simple, and they were called the Vasquez Doctrine, and the doctrine stated that humanity would wage this war the way Ilara Vasquez would have wanted, and that meant protecting innocent lives regardless of species. Human forces liberated hegemony colony worlds that had been stripped of their defenses, and instead of occupying them, they left behind food and medicine and functioning infrastructure, and then they moved on. The galaxy could not comprehend this, and the hegemony's own propaganda had painted humans as bloodthirsty savages for 900 years, and now, those same savages were winning a war while actively protecting alien civilians, and the cognitive dissonance was shattering the narrative that Drethka had spent his career building. On a liberated Velkari colony, World, a human marine squad encountered a group of Velkari children huddled in a bombed-out shelter, and the children were terrified because they had been told that humans ate alien young, and the squad leader knelt down and pulled a ration bar from his pack and broke it in half and offered it to the nearest child, and the child's skin shifted from the gray of fear to the pale blue of wonder. That image was captured by a Velkari journalist, and it spread across the galaxy faster than any weapon ever could. Drethka sat in his command center and watched the war slipping away from him, and he had expected humanity to fight with blind rage, and instead they fought with cold precision, and he had expected the subject species to rally behind the hegemony, and instead they were peeling away one by one, and he stared at the tactical display showing ghost fleet positions, and he realized something that made his blood run cold. Humanity had always been this strong, and the Concordance had never been a leash on them, and it had been a leash they had placed on themselves. And for 900 years, they had chosen to be gentle, and Drethka had mistaken that gentleness for weakness, and now he was learning the difference. Admiral Richter received a priority message from Drethka demanding humanity's unconditional surrender, and Richter read it on the bridge of the TNS Ilara Vasquez, which had been renamed within hours of her death, because the crew had voted unanimously, and Richter composed his reply, and it contained one line. "You killed our best, and now you meet our worst." He sent it, and then he turned to his tactical officer and said, "Show me Drethka's supply lines." And the officer brought up the display, and Richter studied it with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. Because he did, and Drethka did not, and both of them knew it. 6 months into the war, the hegemony of United Worlds was dying, and it was not dying the way empires usually die, with a single great battle or a dramatic last stand, but slowly and quietly, like a tree rotting from the inside, while its leaves still looked green. Drethka had imagined a swift and glorious campaign, and he had imagined hegemony fleets sweeping through human space and burning their colonies and shattering their will and forcing them to kneel, and instead he was losing on every front, and the losing was not dramatic enough to rally his people, and it was just a steady grinding erosion of everything he had built. The ghost fleets had cut hegemony supply lines across 3 entire sectors, and warships that had launched with full ammunition stores and fuel reserves were now drifting in deep space with empty tanks and cold guns, waiting for resupply convoys that would never arrive, because Admiral Richter had mapped every logistics route in the hegemony and severed them one by one, with the patience of a surgeon removing a tumor. The Vasquez doctrine was winning the war in ways that weapons alone never could, and every hegemony world that Terran forces touched was left better than they found it. And this was not an accident, and it was not mercy, and it was strategy of the highest order, because Vasquez had taught Richter that the most powerful weapon in any war was the truth, and the truth was that humanity had never wanted this fight. Freed Velkari colonies began requesting Terran protection, and the requests came not from politicians or military leaders, but from ordinary citizens who had watched human soldiers share food with their children and repair their damaged infrastructure and leave without taking anything. And these citizens looked at their own hegemony overlords who had stripped their worlds of resources for centuries, and they made a choice. Orusian scientists began defecting, and they brought with them intelligence on hegemony weapons programs and fleet positions and communication codes, and they came not because they were bribed or coerced, but because they had watched the unedited footage of Vasquez's assassination, and they had read their own High Council's report exposing Drethka's fabrications, and they were ashamed. And then the Den arrived. A fleet of 200 Den warships appeared unannounced at a Terran staging ground near the border, and the Terran commander scrambled her fighters and prepared for battle. And then the Den warchief appeared on her view screen, and he bared his teeth, which among the Den was a sign of respect, and he said that his warriors had come to fight beside humanity in the name of the Iron Dove. The Terran commander stared at her screen for a long moment, and then she lowered her weapons and opened her docking bays, and Den warriors walked onto a human warship for the first time in galactic history. And the two species looked at each other, and neither of them smiled, because both of them understood that this was not a happy occasion, and it was a funeral procession for the old galaxy, and the bloody, difficult birth of a new one. Drethka watched the Den defection from his fortress moon of Keth Vorin, and something in his compound eyes flickered, and it might have been fear, and it might have been the beginning of understanding that he had miscalculated so badly that the word miscalculation was no longer sufficient. He decided on a desperate gamble, and he assembled a hidden dreadnought fleet, and he ordered them to bypass the front lines entirely and strike directly at Earth, because if he could destroy humanity's homeworld, then surely their will to fight would collapse. The fleet was massive, and it was the last great concentration of hegemony military power, and Drethka had been saving it for exactly this moment. And the ships jumped to faster-than-light travel and crossed the void toward the Sol system. They arrived expecting to find a vulnerable world. They found a fortress. Earth's orbital defense grid was another one of humanity's quiet projects, and it had been built over centuries in plain sight, disguised as civilian infrastructure and communications satellites and research stations. And when Drethka's fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the grid activated, and the sky above Earth bloomed with weapons platforms that had been sleeping since before Drethka was born. The Battle of Sol lasted 9 hours, and it was savage beyond description, and hegemony dreadnoughts hammered the defense grid with everything they had, and human stations burned, and human soldiers died, but the grid held, and the Ghost Fleet reserves arrived within the first hour and caught Drethka's fleet from behind, and the killing was methodical and precise. When it was over, the hegemony fleet was destroyed, and the wreckage formed a ring around Earth that would take decades to clear, and Drethka's personal flagship had escaped with critical damage, and he limped back toward hegemony space, knowing that he had thrown his last punch, and it had not been enough. On Keth Vorin, Drethka sat alone in his command chamber and stared at the tactical display showing red markers where his fleet used to be. And for the first time in his long life, he had no plan. Meanwhile, something else was happening, and it was happening in the private chambers of High Sovereign Thalvexis. The Sovereign's personal physicians had been replaced 3 months into the war after a Velkari medical team had examined him and discovered the cocktail of drugs that Drethka's people had been feeding him, and the drugs had kept him confused and compliant, and they had clouded his mind so thoroughly that he had signed the dissolution of the Concordance without understanding what he was doing. Now the drugs were gone, and Thalvexis was lucid for the first time in over a year, and he sat on his throne, and he was ancient and frail, and his carapace was cracked with age, but his eyes were clear. His advisors brought him recordings, and they started with Vasquez's actual speech and the unedited version, and he listened to her words about open borders and shared futures and alliance, and he heard the warmth in her voice and the sincerity, and he watched her face as she spoke, and he saw that she meant every word. Then he watched her die. Then he watched Drethka's broadcast declaring the dissolution, and he heard the lies, and he recognized them as lies because Thalvexis was old. But he was not stupid, and he had ruled for a very long time, and he knew what truth sounded like, and he knew what deception sounded like. And then something happened that his attendants had never seen, and a chemical response triggered in his ancient body, and fluid leaked from his compound eyes, and it was the hegemony equivalent of weeping, and his species had not exhibited this response in millennia, because they had evolved past it, or so they believed. He sat on his throne and wept for a woman he had never met who had come to his station with open hands, offering his people a gift, and his people had killed her for it. When he was finished, he summoned his most trusted courier, and he dictated a message to Admiral Richter, and the message was transmitted through back channels that even Drethka did not know existed, and it said, "I did not order this, and she came with open hands, and we answered with fire, and what would your general have wanted?" The message arrived on the bridge of the TNS Ilara Vasquez, and Richter read it alone in his quarters, and he set it down and pressed his palms flat on his desk and breathed. He knew the answer, and he had always known the answer, because Vasquez had spent 30 years teaching it to him, and the answer was that she would have wanted peace, and she would have wanted the all. And she would have wanted the future she described in her speech, and she would not have wanted revenge no matter how much it was deserved. He called for Ambassador Morrow. Morrow arrived within the hour, and he was thin and exhausted from months of broadcasting from hidden relay stations, and running from hegemony security forces, and his eyes were older than his years, but they still held something that Richter recognized, because it was the same thing Vasquez had carried. "Hope. The Sovereign wants to talk," Richter said, and he showed Morrow the message. Morrow read it twice and looked up and said, "What do you want to do?" Richter stared at the viewport showing the stars, and somewhere out there Drethka was cornered and weakened, and the war was almost won, and humanity could crush what remained of the hegemony, and no one in the galaxy would blame them. "I want to burn them all," Richter said quietly, "and that is exactly why I will not." He composed a reply to Thalvexis, and it said, "Prove it and deliver Drethka, and acknowledge the truth, and we will show you what humanity does when given a second chance." He sent it, and then he turned to Morrow and said, "Start drafting a treaty, and make it everything she wanted and more." Morrow nodded and sat down and began to write, and his hands were shaking, but his words were steady. The fortress moon of Keth Vorin hung in the void like a clenched fist, and its surface bristled with weapons platforms and shield generators, and it had been War Admiral Drethka's seat of power for decades, and he had designed it to be impregnable, and he had designed it to withstand the assault of any fleet in the galaxy. He had not designed it to withstand every fleet in the galaxy at once. They came from 4 directions, and they came together, and the Terran Ghost Fleet approached from the galactic north, with Admiral Richter's flagship at the center, and the Valkyrie flotilla came from the east with their elegant silver ships moving in perfect geometric formations, and the Orusian heavy cruisers came from the south with their hulls glowing orange from the heat of their massive engines, and the Den warships came from the west, and they came fast because the Den did everything fast. It was the first combined military operation in galactic history, and it was the very thing that General Vasquez had proposed in her alliance speech, and it had been born not in a ceremony hall but in blood and grief and shared outrage, and it was imperfect, and messy, and the 4 fleets did not coordinate smoothly, because they had never trained together, and their communication systems were barely compatible. But they came, and that was what mattered. High Sovereign Thalvexis had given the order to move against Drethka, and the order had split the remaining hegemony military in half, and those who were loyal to the Sovereign joined. The coalition and those who were loyal to Drethka retreated to Keth Vorin for a last stand. The battle began at dawn by Galactic Standard Time, and it was the kind of battle that historians would write about for centuries, and Drethka's forces fought with the desperation of beings who knew they had no future, and the coalition forces fought with something harder to define, and it was not vengeance, and it was not duty, and it was the furious stubborn belief that the galaxy could be better than this. Terran fighters flew alongside Den interceptors, and the Den pilots howled their war cries over open channels, and the human pilots answered with their own shouts. And for a few wild hours, the 2 most warlike species in the galaxy fought side by side, and discovered that they had more in common than either had ever imagined. Valkyrie electronic warfare ships jammed Drethka's communications, and blinded his sensor arrays, and Orusian heavy cruisers smashed through his orbital defense platforms with brute force that would have made a human battleship captain weep with appreciation. Layer by layer, the fortress moon's defenses were stripped away. Drethka watched from his command center deep in the core of Keth Vorin, and he watched his fleet die, and his shields fail, and his weapons go silent one by one. And he knew that it was over, and he had known it was over since the Battle of Saul, but he had refused to accept it, because acceptance would mean admitting that everything he believed about humanity was wrong. He had believed that humans were weak, and he had believed that their compassion was a flaw, and he had believed that their desire for peace was a sign of cowardice, and he had believed these things for his entire life, and he had built his career on them, and he had started a war because of them, and now that war had proven every single one of his beliefs to be catastrophically incorrect. He activated the dead man's switch. It was his final contingency, and it was connected to a device buried in the heart of Nexus Station, and the device was designed to destabilize the dead star that the station orbited and collapse it into a singularity that would consume the station and everything within 100 million kilometers. If he could not win then, he would ensure that no peace could ever be signed in the place where Vasquez died, and he would destroy the symbol of everything she represented. And he entered the activation code, and the countdown began. On Nexus Station, alarms screamed to life, and the station's crew detected the destabilization beginning in the dead star's core, and they had less than 1 hour before the collapse became irreversible. Admiral Richter received the alert in the middle of the battle, and he made a decision in 3 seconds, and he pulled a Terran strike team from the assault on Keth Voran's outer defenses and redirected them to a breach point near the command center, and he led them personally. The strike team cut through the Fortress Moon's corridors with brutal efficiency, and Richter was at the front, and he carried a plasma rifle in one hand and a sidearm in the other, and he moved like a man half his age because Fury has a way of erasing years, and behind him were 12 of the best soldiers humanity had ever produced. They reached the command center and blew the blast doors open, and inside they found Drethka standing alone, because his guards had either fled or died, and the War Admiral was tall, and his carapace was scarred from decades of combat, and his compound eyes burned with hatred as he looked at the human who had come for him. "You should have stayed in your cradle world," Drethka snarled, and his voice was thick with contempt. "The galaxy was never meant for vermin like you, and you breed and you spread, and you infect everything you touch with your weakness and your sentiment." Richter raised his rifle. "She would have let you live," Richter said, and his voice was quiet, and Drethka blinked, because he had expected rage, and instead he got something that looked almost like sadness. "She would have sat across a table from you and offered you her hand, and you would have spat on it, and she would have offered it again, because that is what she was, and that is what you killed." "Then she was a fool," Drethka said. "No," Richter said, "she was the best of us, and I am not her, and I want to pull this trigger more than I have ever wanted anything in my life, but I will not, because she did not spend 30 years teaching me to be a good man, so that I could throw it away on you." He lowered his rifle, and his soldiers moved in, and they restrained Drethka, and the War Admiral struggled and hissed and cursed, but it was over, and he knew it. Richter activated his communicator and said, "Send me the deactivation codes for the dead man's switch." Drethka laughed and said, "There are no deactivation codes." On Nexus Station, the countdown continued, and the dead star's core was becoming unstable, and the station's engineers worked frantically. And then a Terran physicist and a Velkari quantum specialist looked at each other across a console, and the Velkari said, "I have an idea, but it requires your species' insane tolerance for radiation." And the Terran said, "Tell me what to do." They worked together in the heart of the station's reactor, and the radiation would have killed the Velkari in minutes, but the human engineer absorbed doses that would have been lethal to any other species in the galaxy, and kept working, and the Velkari guided him through the quantum mechanics, and together they built a containment field that had never been attempted before. With 11 seconds remaining on the countdown, they stabilized the dead star's core, and the alarms went silent, and the station's crew erupted into cheers, and the Terran engineer collapsed from radiation exposure, and the Velkari caught him and held him and called for medics. He survived, and at his bedside 3 days later the Velkari engineer held his hand with 2 of her 4 arms and said, "Your species is completely insane," and he grinned and said, "We get that a lot." Drethka was transported to Nexus Station in chains, and he was tried before a galactic tribunal, and it was the first tribunal of its kind, and judges from every species sat in judgment, and the trial lasted 3 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming, and Drethka was found guilty of crimes against peace and sentenced to imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life. He never spoke publicly again. The Treaty of Nexus was signed in the Grand Atrium on the 1-year anniversary of Vasquez's assassination, and delegates from every species in the galaxy were present, and they walked across a floor of transparent material, and beneath their feet, preserved under the glass, was the bloodstain where Vasquez had fallen, and it had been left there deliberately, so that no one who signed the treaty would forget what it had cost. The treaty established the Galactic Cooperative, and it was everything Vasquez had dreamed of and more, and it created a shared government with representatives from every species, and it opened all borders, and it established mutual defense and joint research programs and cultural exchanges, and it did everything that Vasquez's unfinished speech had promised. Ambassador Morrow gave the opening address, and he stood at the same podium where Vasquez had stood 1 year earlier, and he was not the same young man who had caught her as she fell, and his eyes were older, and his voice was deeper. But when he spoke, the atrium went silent just as it had for her. He read the final paragraph of Vasquez's speech, and the words she had never been allowed to say, and his voice did not waver as he read them. And the words spoke of a galaxy where no child would grow up afraid of the sky, and where the distance between stars would be measured not in light years but in handshakes, and where the silence between civilizations would be replaced not by noise but by conversation. When he finished, the atrium was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had followed the gunshot, and this quiet was full and warm and alive. A statue of General Vasquez was erected at the center of Nexus Station, and it was cast from metal that had been melted down from the weapons of the war, and she stood with her hands open, and her face turned toward the stars, and the plaque at her feet read, General Ilara Vasquez, the Iron Dove. They killed her to start a war, she ended it anyway. 100 years later, a young Velkari girl visited Nexus Station on a school trip, and she stood before the statue and looked up at the bronze face and tugged on the sleeve of her human classmate and asked, "Why does the statue lady look sad?" The human boy thought about it for a moment and tilted his head and studied the statue's face and said, "I do not think she is sad, and I think she is waiting." "Waiting for what?" the Velkari girl asked. "To make sure we got it right this time." The two children stood there for a while longer, and then the Velkari girl reached out and took the human boy's hand, and they walked away together through a station that orbited a dead star and was more alive than it had ever been. Above them, the statue of General Ilara Vasquez stood with open hands and watched them go. And if bronze could smile, then perhaps she did, because 900 years of silence had finally become something better. It had become a conversation. The sensors on the EFS Steadfast went off at 300 hours, station time. Not one alarm, not two. Every single alarm on the bridge lit up at the same time, filling the room with noise and red light. Admiral Kang Wu was already awake. He had been standing at the wide observation window, looking out at the dark between the stars when the alarm started. He did not run to the command chair. He walked. He sat down. He looked at the screens. And he started counting. 17,000 warships came out of fold space in perfect formation. They appeared one by one at first, then dozens at a time, then hundreds. They came from every direction above the ecliptic plane, below it, from the far side of the sun, from behind Jupiter and Saturn and the cold outer dark past Neptune. They kept coming until the screens could barely track them all. When they stopped, they had formed a complete sphere around the entire Sol system. Not around Earth, around the whole system. Every planet, every moon, every deep space station, every colony ship in transit, all of it inside a ring of alien steel. Kang Wu finished counting. He leaned back in his chair. "Give me a full system contact report," he said. His voice was flat and quiet. His bridge crew moved fast. They were scared. He could see it in the way they held their shoulders, but they were professionals. They did their jobs. Numbers came in from every sensor relay in the system, from Luna Base, from Mars Orbit Defense, from the colony platforms around Europa and Ganymede, from the outer watch stations near Pluto. All the same story, all the same number. 17,212 ships. Earth had 406 combat-capable vessels. Most of them were patrol ships and escort frigates. The heavy fleet numbered 61 ships. Against 17,000, those numbers meant almost nothing on paper. Kang Wu knew that. He also knew that paper didn't fight wars. People did. The main screen flickered. A transmission was coming in. The communication officer, a young man named Jiang Bin, looked over his shoulder. "It's on all channels, Admiral, all frequencies. They want everyone to hear it." "Put it up," Kang Wu said. The message played. There was no face on the screen, just a signal, translated by software the Conquered had provided themselves 3 years ago during failed trade talks. The translation was perfect. The Galactic Conquered had made sure of that. They wanted humanity to understand every single word. The message said that humanity had broken 12 expansion protocols. Humanity had built colonies in 31 star systems outside their permitted zone. Humanity had ignored 9 rounds of mediation. The Galactic Conquered had been patient long enough. Now humanity had 72 hours to do 3 things: shut down all military forces, leave all colonies outside the permitted zone, and accept Conquered authority over Earth and all its people. If those 3 things were not done within 72 hours, the Conquered fleet would sterilize the Sol system. That word, sterilize, sat in the air of the bridge like something cold. Then the transmission ended. For a moment, nobody said anything. On Earth, the message had played on every screen in every city in every language. People stopped in the middle of streets. Parents picked up their children and held them. Governments called emergency sessions that had no real agenda because no one had prepared for this, because no one had believed it would actually happen. News channels showed the same image on a loop, a map of the solar system with a thin red sphere drawn around it. Inside, humanity. Outside, the Conquered. In the command bunker beneath Busan, Ambassador Lim Dea read the transcript of the message a 4th time. She was not a military officer. She was a diplomat who had spent 20 years trying to find humanity a fair place in a galaxy that did not seem very interested in making room. She had sat across from alien negotiators who smiled at her and gave her nothing. She knew exactly what this ultimatum was. It was not a negotiation. It was a receipt. The Conquered had already decided the outcome. They were just telling humanity what had been decided. General Cho Muru stood at the far end of the table, looking at the star map on the wall. He lit a cigarette. No one told him not to. He stared at the red sphere on the map for a long time. "They've done this before," Lim Dea said, "to other species. Every time it worked." "How many species said no?" Cho asked. Lim Dea was quiet for a moment. "None." Cho nodded slowly. He took a long drag of his cigarette. "Then they don't know what no looks like yet." On Ganymede's outer perimeter station, Private Han Ju was eating instant noodles when the announcement came through the station speakers. He put down his fork. He listened to the whole message. When it finished, he sat there for a minute just thinking. Then he picked his fork back up and finished his noodles. He had a shift in 3 hours. There was no point in being hungry for it. Back on the bridge of the EFS Steadfast, Admiral Kang Wu opened a fleet-wide communication channel. Every human ship in the system could hear him. Every crew member at every post. The scared ones and the angry ones and the quiet ones. All of them listening. He did not give a speech. He did not talk about history or sacrifice or the cost of freedom. He had never been that kind of man. He believed in clear orders, not poetry. He said 4 words. "Hold your positions, wait." Then he closed the channel, stood up from his command chair, and walked back to the observation window. He looked out at the alien ships, so many of them that some were now visible to the naked eye, like new stars that had appeared overnight, cold and very close. He thought about the 72 hours ahead. He thought about what his people were capable of when they had a real reason. He almost smiled. Almost. The Conquered fleet waited, their sensors watched, their analysts took notes. What they saw looked, on the surface, like chaos. On Earth, governments were holding emergency meetings. People were panic buying food and water. News channels were running the same footage over and over. Churches and temples were full. Some people were crying in the streets. The analysts filed a report at the 6-hour mark. It said the same thing most of their reports had said about species facing a conquered ultimatum. Psychological collapse was beginning. Surrender paperwork was expected within 40 hours, well ahead of the deadline. They were looking at the wrong things. While the surface of Earth showed fear, underneath it something very different was happening. Humanity was not collapsing. It was working. Dr. Parkin-Ha had not gone home in 2 days. Her office in the Unified Defense Research Building in Seoul looked like something between a laboratory and a scrapyard. Holographic schematics floated in the air at 6 different heights. Empty coffee cups covered every surface. Papers, real paper, because In-Ha always thought better with real paper, were spread across the floor in loose piles that she somehow always knew the exact contents of. 3 years ago, she had developed a weapon theory called the adaptive resonance disruptor. The theory was based on the way certain energy frequencies could interfere with the power systems of large ships, not destroy them, disable them, lock their fold drives, pin them in place. The project had been shelved because the testing was dangerous, and the budget for that cycle had gone to colony defense systems instead. She pulled it off the shelf. She called Lieutenant Beek Saul at 4 in the morning. He was already awake. He was always awake when something needed thinking about. He came to her lab within the hour and stood among the floating schematics with his hands in his pockets, nodding slowly, asking quiet questions that cut right to the parts of the theory that needed the most work. Beek Saul was 26 years old. He was the youngest officer in the history of Earth's Fleet Tactical Division. His commanders sometimes forgot how young he was because he never talked like a 26-year-old. He talked like someone who had been studying a problem for a very long time and had finally found someone worth sharing the answer with. "If you fire these in sequence," he said, pointing at the schematics, "targeting the command vessels first, their fleet loses coordination before it can respond. By the time the outer ring reacts, the inner formation is already blind." Parkin-Ha looked at him. "That's exactly what I thought." "Then let's build it," Beek Saul said. On the lunar shipyards, engineer Shin T was already building something else. He had been given 12 hours, a full team of 300 engineers, and instructions to do whatever he thought was most useful. Shin T had spent most of his career designing deep-sea pressure vessels for Europa's ocean research stations. He knew more about how materials behaved under extreme stress than almost anyone alive. He had been thinking for 2 years about a different kind of hull plating. Standard warship hulls absorbed energy weapon hits. Some energy became heat. The rest became damage. The math always worked against the defending ship. But Shin T had been studying deep-sea data, the way certain layered composite materials didn't just absorb pressure. They redirected it, sent it sideways, changed its direction without destroying the surface it moved through. He believed the same idea could work on a warship hull, that energy weapon hits didn't have to be absorbed. They could be redirected, sent back out at an angle, turned from damage into power for the ship's own systems. He had never had the time or the resources to test it properly. He had 12 hours now. He gathered his team, explained the idea in 3 minutes, answered questions for 2 more, then told everyone to get to work. The lunar shipyard floor became the loudest place in the solar system. Metal rang, welders burned bright, fabrication machines ran without stopping. Nobody went home, nobody asked to. On Mars, General Cho Muru was doing something that looked on paper like madness. He was rewriting Earth's entire combat doctrine in 36 hours, not adjusting it, not updating a few sections, rewriting it from the beginning. The old doctrine had been built around the idea that humanity would mostly be fighting defensive battles, protecting colonies, holding territory, escorting civilian ships. It was built for a species that expected to be pushed back and had to make the best of it. Cho had always thought that kind of thinking was a disease. You built what you believed. If you built retreat plans, You built a retreating army. He replaced the old doctrine with one simple idea. Every battlefield has a gap. There is always a place the other side did not fully think about, did not fully prepare for, because they were too focused on their own strength to notice the empty space beside it. The job of a soldier was not to run at the strongest part of the enemy line. It was to find the gap and walk through it. He drilled every unit in the system on this. He sent updated tactical files to every ship, every station, every outpost in the Sol system. He ran simulations. He slept 4 hours in the entire 36, sitting up in a chair, and was back at the maps before most of his staff realized he had been asleep. Ambassador Lim Dea was doing something different from all of them. She was talking. She opened a diplomatic channel to the Concord at the A-Tower mark and began asking questions. She asked for clarification on which specific subclauses of the expansion protocols had been violated. She asked for full copies of the mediation records from all 9 cycles. She asked about the exact legal meaning of the word sterilization, as used in the Concord's formal declaration. She asked whether the 72-hour window was measured in Earth hours or standard Concord time cycles, and what the official conversion rate was, and whether there was a record of how that conversion had been calculated in past ultimatums. She had no intention of surrendering. She was buying time. Every hour she kept a Concord diplomat answering document requests was another hour for Shin T's team on the shipyard floor, another hour for Park In-ha's disruptors, another hour for Cho Muru's drills. She had grown up watching her grandmother run a small market stall in Jeonju. Her grandmother had been the best person at negotiation she had ever known. The old woman's method was simple. Keep talking, keep your face calm and friendly, ask more questions, and never let them see that you already know exactly how this ends. Lim Dea already knew exactly how this ended. She just needed more time to make sure her people were ready for it. Private Han Ju spent most of the 72 hours at his post on the outer perimeter of Ganymede Station, watching the alien fleet through the reinforced observation port. There were so many ships that counting them felt pointless. He had tried once and stopped somewhere around 300. He thought about writing a letter home for a long time, and then at the 30-hour mark he actually wrote it. He kept it short. He folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his uniform, against his chest. Then he picked up his rifle, went back to his post, and stood there with the expression of a man who had work to do and intended to do it. At the 68th hour mark, the Concord analysts filed another report. It noted that human activity across the system appeared disorganized and emotionally driven. It noted signs of distress in the civilian population. It projected a 91% probability of surrender before the deadline expired. The analysts had very good sensors, very thorough methods, very detailed reports. None of them had thought to look at what was happening inside the lunar shipyards. The 72-hour clock hit zero at 600 hours, Earth Standard Time. The Concord diplomatic channel had been open all night. Ambassador Lim Dea had kept it that way, asking questions, requesting documents, maintaining the careful and patient tone of a woman who might still be persuaded. The Concord diplomat on the other end had grown gradually more comfortable as the hours passed. The human's questions were slowing down. She was running out of things to ask. This was how it always went in the end. They always ran out of things to say before they had to say the hard thing. At 600 exactly, Lim Dea stood up from the communication table. She smoothed her jacket. She looked at the camera directly. Then she did not answer the Concord diplomat's latest question. She opened a different channel, not a reply, not a private line. A full broadcast, system-wide, every Concord ship, every human vessel, every station, colony, and outpost in the Sol system. She spoke in standard Galactic. No translator, no notes in front of her. She had been saying these words quietly to herself for 3 days until they felt like something solid. The United Earth government has reviewed the terms of the Galactic Concord's ultimatum in full. After complete deliberation by all relevant authorities, Earth's official and final response is as follows. She stopped for exactly 1 second. No. She closed the channel. She sat back down. She poured herself a cup of tea from the small flask she had brought from home. Her hands were perfectly steady. On the bridge of the EFS Steadfast, Admiral Kang Wu heard the broadcast. He had been sitting at his command chair waiting for it, still and quiet in the way of a man who has already made all of his decisions and is simply waiting for the moment to act on them. He looked at his crew, at Jiang Bin at the communication station, at the tactical officers bent over their boards, at the young ensigns gripping the edges of their consoles, and he opened the fleet military channel. All fleet elements, he said. His voice was calm the way a very deep river is calm. You are weapons-free. Engage on your own tactical judgment. Make them remember this day. For half a second, nothing moved. Then everything moved at once. Captain Yun Rei had spent 3 days looking at the conquered formation the way Beak Saul had taught her to look at any battlefield, not at what was there but at what was missing, not at the strength but at the gap beside the strength. And she had found one. On the left flank of the encirclement there was an opening, not large, not obvious. A space that existed because the conquered had positioned their ships with complete confidence that, by this moment, human commanders would be thinking about how to word the surrender document, not where to drive a warship. Yun Rei drove the EFS Defiant straight at the gap. She pushed the ship to full military thrust. 6 escort vessels matched her heading without being told. They had seen the same gap in Beak Saul's briefing, and they knew what the plan was. They moved together like a blade going through the space between ribs, not fighting the armor, just finding the place where there was none. At the same moment, Park In-ha's adaptive resonance disruptors fired for the first time in actual combat. The disruptors had been loaded onto 12 of Earth's heaviest ships over the past 40 hours. They were not clean-looking weapons. They made a strange, low sound when fired, a deep hum that the crew felt in their teeth more than heard with their ears. The targeting was precise and deliberate. 3 conquered command vessels in the inner ring of the formation. The targets were not chosen to destroy. They were chosen to blind, to lock fold drives, to pin the Concorde's most important ships in place. The first disruptor hit, then the second, then the third. On the Concorde command ships, engineers stared at their boards in confusion. Fold drives were not responding, not damaged. The structural readouts showed nothing wrong. No hull breach, no fires, no power failure. The drives were simply locked the way a door is locked. Every attempt to spool for emergency retreat returned an error message. They were not going anywhere. The Concorde commander stood on his bridge and looked at what his sensors were showing him. His command vessels were pinned. The human fleet was not scattering in fear or making desperate random attacks. It was moving with clear purpose, formations shifting, strike groups accelerating through identified gaps, support ships holding back in positions that covered the forward elements. It was structured. It was thought out. It had been planned before the clock even hit 0. And then his communications officer said the thing the commander would keep thinking about for a very long time after the battle was over. "Admiral," she said, "the humans on their bridge cameras, they are smiling." The commander looked at the secondary screen where the captured feeds played. He looked at the face of the captain on the lead human vessel, a woman leaning slightly forward in her chair, head up, eyes moving fast across her screens. The expression on her face was not the expression of someone fighting for survival. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was now, finally, in it. "They are outnumbered 40-1, his communications officer said, as if stating the fact again might make the smiling make more sense. "I know," the commander said. "They know that." "I know they know," he said. And for the first time in 40 years of expanding the Concorde's reach across the galaxy, he did not have anything else to add. On Earth's surface, Billions of people were watching. Some were still very afraid. Most had been afraid for 3 days, but the fear was changing shape now. It was still there, it did not go away, but underneath it something else was growing. Something that felt like heat in a room that had been cold for too long. People leaned toward their screens. They watched the first battle reports come in. They watched the small human fleet move through the vast ring of alien ships like something that was not afraid of the ring. The conquered fleet had come to this system expecting a ceremony, a formal act of submission, papers signed, a species that understood what it was facing and accepted the logical conclusion. What they found instead was different. What they found was a species that had looked at the logical conclusion and decided the logic was wrong. The battle for the Sol system had begun, and from the very first second, it did not look anything like the Conquered had planned. On the Defiant, Beak Sol was already on his second set of updated tactical calculations, his stylus moving fast, adjusting the probability models as new data came in. The gap in the left flank was holding. The disruptors had performed perfectly. The hull plating on the ship's Shin T's team had modified was absorbing its first hits, and the power readings were doing something that made the damage control officer stare at his board with his mouth slightly open. "Sir," the damage control officer said to Yun-Ray, "our power cells are charging." "I know," Yun-Ray said, without looking up from the main tactical screen. "Shin T says hello." Outside, the battle spread across the solar system like fire finding new fuel, quick and bright, and going in every direction at once, driven not by desperation, but by 3 days of very careful thinking. Humanity was not losing. Not even close. The battle lasted 11 days. The Conquered had not planned for 11 days. They had planned for a short, controlled action, a brief show of force followed by a formal surrender. Their operations team had scheduled a post-mission debrief for Day 4. The catering for the victory meeting had been ordered in advance. By Day 4, they had lost 93 ships. Not all of them destroyed. Most were disabled, fold drives locked by Park and Haas disruptors, engines cut by precise strikes from Beak Sol's targeting teams, power systems knocked out by attacks that hit components the Conquered fleet had never thought to protect, because no species in their history had known those components were worth targeting. The ship schematics that had made all of this possible had come from an old leaked file, passed quietly to humanity 2 years ago by a Vreth engineer who asked for nothing in return, but that someone remember the gesture was made. Beak Sol ran his tactical models from the Defiant's command room, standing at a holographic display table with a cup of cold coffee in one hand and a stylus in the other. He updated his probability calculations every 30 minutes. He tracked every Conquered formation shift, every attempt at reorganization, every new defensive pattern they tried. Every time the Conquered adapted, Beak Sol had already seen several moves ahead and quietly sent new targeting orders to the fleet. He was 26 years old and he moved through information the way some people move through water naturally, without effort, like the environment itself was made for him. Captain Yun-Ray watched him work sometimes between engagements. She had served with good tactical officers before. Beak Sol was a different kind of thing. He did not just calculate outcomes. He seemed to feel where the battle was moving before the numbers confirmed it. The way someone who has walked a dark road many times knows where the stones are without looking down. On Day 5, Shin T's hull plating proved itself in the most direct way possible. 3 Conquered cruisers locked their weapons onto the EFS Ironwall, a heavy defense ship holding the left flank position alone, while the rest of the formation repositioned around a new gap Beak Sol had identified. The weapons fired. Every crew member on the iron wall braced. The hits came in hard and bright. Then the damage reports came back, almost nothing. And then the power board lit up. The ship's main drive cells were showing a charge increase. The hull plating had redirected the energy, not all of it, not perfectly, but enough. The conquered cruisers had fired their weapons at the iron wall and made it stronger. They fired again. The iron wall's power went up again. The ship's captain, a quiet man named Yi, stared at his board for a long moment. Then he sent a short message to Shin Ti on the lunar shipyard. "It actually works." Shin Ti read the message, nodded once, and went back to building more. The conquered cruisers kept firing. Yi let them. He was in no hurry. General Cho Muru ran the battle from a command center on Mars, surrounded by his maps and his cigarettes and his very uncomplicated philosophy. He did not try to match the conquered ship for ship. He did not try to hold a fixed line in space. He moved Earth's forces in constantly shifting patterns, never defending the same position twice, never attacking the same way twice, always moving toward gaps, always forcing the conquered to react instead of act. His thinking went back thousands of years of human warfare, applied to three-dimensional space combat, because to Cho, a battlefield was a battlefield regardless of whether it had a sky. The conquered fleet was not unprepared for human aggression. They had studied humanity. They had detailed models for how humans behaved under pressure, models built from years of observation, from the way humans had responded to every smaller conflict and territorial dispute in the years before this moment. The models were good. They covered fear and determination and sacrifice and desperation very well. What the models did not cover was what humans did when they were enjoying themselves. Because some of them were. Not in a cruel way, not taking pleasure in destruction, but in the way of people doing something they were built for, doing it with others they trusted, doing it better than anyone had expected, doing it in a situation where all the pressure and preparation of years had finally found a place to land. The Conquered's tactical computers kept recording outcomes that didn't match predictions and filing them under anomalous human behavior. The file kept growing. A junior Conquered analyst, a young member of the Vreth species, assigned to the fleet in an auxiliary role, wrote in his personal log on day 7, "They do not repeat themselves. Not once in 7 days of fighting have I seen the same tactic used the same way twice. It is as if they are not following a plan at all, but they clearly have one. I cannot find it. I have stopped trying to find the specific plan and started trying to understand how a mind thinks when it cannot be predicted. I am not sure that can be studied from the outside." He kept writing. He would write every day until the battle ended. On day 6, the Conquered tried a different approach. They sent a boarding force to Ganymede Station, 50 soldiers in powered combat suits, cutting through the outer hull with plasma tools. The plan was to take the station, hold its 4,000 personnel as leverage, and force Kang Wu to order a stand-down. It was a clean, logical move. It had worked before against other species in other situations. What they found inside was Private Hanju. Hanju and 4 other soldiers held Corridor 7, the main access route from the breach point to the station's command center, for 9 hours straight. They had no powered suits. They had standard-issue rifles, 2 crates of spare power cells pulled from a nearby storage room, a section of blast shielding that all 5 of them had dragged from a maintenance bay down the hall, and a pressurized coolant line that ran along the ceiling of the corridor. Hanju used the blast shielding as a movable barrier. He repositioned it every time the boarding party tried a new angle. He used the spare power cells to keep their rifles running without any break in fire. And at the 3-hour mark, when the boarding party pushed hard and nearly broke through, he reached up and cracked the release valve on the coolant line. The corridor filled with freezing industrial coolant mist in about 4 seconds. Temperature dropped. Visibility dropped to nothing. The boarding party's suits were built for combat, not for sudden extreme cold combined with zero visibility in a tight space. They fell back. 2 hours later they tried again, this time with heat sensors to cut through the mist. The blast shielding had already been repositioned. The 5 soldiers had also moved the spare power cells and set them in a new configuration that forced the boarding party into a narrower angle of approach. They tried 3 more times. Each time the corridor held. Each time something in the setup had changed just enough. At the 9-hour mark, with the main fleet battle shifting toward Ganymede and conquered forces pulling back to consolidate, the boarding party retreated fully and did not come back. Han Ju's after-action report was 6 paragraphs long. His commanding officer, reading it the next day, noticed that the phrase used most often was, "We adjusted." On day 8, the Vreth analyst received a message through an old civilian signal frequency that the Conquered had not been monitoring carefully because no military information was supposed to travel on it. The message was from a Vreth civilian living in a Conquered-governed colony 40 light-years away, watching the battle reports come in from a small screen in a small room. It said in their language, "We are watching." The analyst sat with that message for a while. Then he forwarded it to Ambassador Lim Dea on Earth, through channels he was not supposed to use because he felt she should know. She wrote back 2 words, "Keep watching." On day 9, Kang Wu received a report that the conquered fleet was beginning to show signs of what the intelligence team carefully called tactical hesitation. Ships were holding position longer before moving. Command communications between vessels had slowed. Formation changes that should have taken minutes were taking hours as commanders checked and rechecked orders against outcomes that kept coming back wrong. Kang Wu read the report. He set it down. "They're second-guessing themselves," Jiang Bin said from the communication station. "Yes," Kang Wu said. "That's good for us." "It was always going to happen," Kang Wu said. "A species that has won 31 times in a row believes winning is normal. The moment it stops being normal, they don't have anything to fall back on." He paused. "We've lost before. We know how to keep going anyway. They don't." On day 10, Park In-ha sent a message to every ship running her disruptors. The message updated the targeting parameters based on 9 days of combat data. The new version was faster, quieter, and hit a different power node that the first version had missed. 16 more conquered vessels went dark within the following 6 hours. The battle kept going, not because anyone wanted war, not because humanity was angry or proud or hungry for a fight. It kept going because the conquered had given humanity a choice between 2 things, submission and resistance, and humanity had chosen. And once humans chose something and understood why they had chosen it, they did not let it go. The Vreth analyst wrote his final daily log entry on the night of day 10. He wrote, "Tomorrow I think will be different." He was right. On the morning of the 11th day, the conquered commander sat alone in his private briefing room for 1 hour before anyone came in. He had a cup of something hot in his hands. He did not drink it. He held it and looked at the tactical display on the wall which showed the current state of his fleet. More than 16,000 of his ships were still operational. Earth was still surrounded. On paper, the numbers were not catastrophic. But something had broken. He could feel it in the way his senior commanders spoke to him now, carefully, with small pauses where confidence used to be. He could feel it in the daily reports, which kept using words like unexpected and unanticipated and no prior data available. He could feel it in the fact that his full drive-disabled ships were still sitting dark in formation, because every recovery attempt had been cut off, that the EFS iron wall was still out there getting stronger every time someone fired at it, that somewhere in a corridor on Ganymede, 5 ordinary soldiers with standard rifles had held off 50 of his best boarding troops for 9 hours, and then written 6 paragraphs about it, as if it had been a fairly normal shift. He had done this 31 times before, 31 species, 31 ultimatums. Every single one had ended the same way. Most surrendered in the first 12 hours. The stubborn ones lasted 3 days. None had reached 11 days and still looked like they had no intention of stopping. He set down the cup, he stood up, he straightened his uniform. Then he called his communications officer and told her to open a channel to the human ambassador. Lim Dea arrived at the meeting room before he did. She was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and one aide, a young man who stood behind her chair and said nothing. She looked rested. She looked like someone who had already lived through the difficult part of the conversation and had arrived at the easy half. She did not stand when the commander entered. She gave a small, respectful nod, the way you might greet someone you have been expecting. He sat down across from her. He looked at her directly. "You were outnumbered 40-1, he said. The words came out slowly, not as an accusation, more like a question, the kind a person asks when they understand what happened but cannot fully process the logic of it. "Yes," Limdea said. She did not add anything to that. She let the word sit there by itself, which somehow made it heavier. He placed the original Concord ultimatum document on the table between them. He had brought it not as a threat, that moment was gone, but as an honest acknowledgement of what this meeting was and why they were both in it. Limdea placed Earth's counterterms beside it without any ceremony. He read them. Full recognition of all 31 human colonies. Full withdrawal of conquered forces from all human-claimed space. Renegotiation of all expansion protocols with human representatives seated at the table as equals, not as a species requesting mercy, but as a party with standing, with rights, with a voice that counted. The room was very quiet. "If we agree to this," he said slowly, "the conquered standing with every species under our governance will be affected. They will see what happened here." "I know," Limdea said. "Every species that has submitted to conquered authority will see that the outcome was different this time." "I know that too," she said. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands. "That's part of why the terms are what they are." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with the calm face of a woman who had grown up watching her grandmother close deals in a market stall in Jeonju, never raising her voice, never showing impatience, always already knowing where the conversation was going to end. He read the counterterms one more time. He thought about the 30 species under conquered governance and what they were watching right now. He thought about the Vreth and the message that Analyst had passed along. He thought about the 40 smaller civilizations the conquered had earmarked for future expansion, species who had not yet been given an ultimatum, but would be, in time, when the conquered decided the moment was right. He thought about what those species were seeing. He picked up the pen, he signed. Limdea did not smile. She did not celebrate or say anything sharp or victorious. She took the signed document, placed it carefully in her case, and stood. She gave another small nod, the same kind her grandmother gave at the end of a good negotiation, when both sides had been treated fairly and the business was finished. Then she and her aide walked out without looking back. On board the EFS Defiant, Captain Yoon Ray read the ceasefire confirmation on her command screen. She leaned back in her chair. Around her, the bridge crew was silent for exactly 1 second, and then someone started laughing, and it moved through the room fast, like something that had been held behind a door for too long and finally had somewhere to go. Lieutenant Beek Saul looked up from his tactical display. He had still been running calculations, purely out of habit, because stopping felt strange. "Did we just win?" he asked. "We didn't lose," Yoon Ray said. "With us, that's usually the same thing." Admiral Kang Woo received the ceasefire confirmation on the Steadfast and read it once. He set it down carefully on the armrest. He got up, walked to the observation window, and looked out at the alien fleet, still vast, still numbering in the thousands, but already beginning to drift apart. The outer formations were separating slowly, ships pulling back from their encirclement positions the way something pulls back when it has decided there is no longer a reason to be where it is. He stood there for a long time and said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. On Ganymede Station, Private Hanju spent the morning of the 11th day doing repair work in Corridor 7. The walls were scorched black in long streaks. The floor had a burn mark that ran its full length. The coolant line he had cracked was still hissing slightly from the emergency seal someone had put on it during the night. He worked quietly and carefully, filling the gaps in the wall, smoothing the rough edges. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the corridor. It would need a proper repair crew eventually. The patchwork he had done was not perfect, but it held. He nodded once to himself, then he went to find something to eat. In her lab in Seoul, Dr. Park In-ha was already working on the next project. She had not slept yet. She had looked at the data from 11 days of combat and found that the resonance disruptors had performed beyond every model she had built. That meant the underlying theory was stronger than she had thought. That meant there were directions she had not fully explored. She pulled 3 shelved projects out of the archive. She made a fresh cup of coffee. She started reading. Engineer Shin T submitted his final battle report on the hull plating from the lunar shipyard and fell asleep before he finished the last sentence. When he woke up 12 hours later, there were 17 messages from fleet commanders asking when the new plating could be fitted to the rest of the ships. General Cho Muru burned the last of his cigarettes, stared at his maps for a long time, and began writing new doctrine, not for the battle that had just ended. For the next moment, whatever shape it came in, when something in the galaxy would look at humanity and make a decision. He intended to make sure that when that moment arrived, the decision had already been made correctly before it started. Across the galaxy, in council rooms and listening posts and small rooms on colony worlds that had been watching the broadcast feeds for 11 days, the same conversation was happening in dozens of different languages. A fleet of 17,000 ships had surrounded a single star system and delivered an ultimatum that had worked 31 times before without a single failure. The species inside the circle had said no. They had said it once clearly, and then they had made it true. Among the Vreth, the young analyst who had been writing his personal log every day of the battle shared his notes publicly. They spread quickly. The part people kept copying and sending to each other was the final line, written on the morning of the 11th day. I spent 11 days trying to find the pattern that explains what humans do. I kept looking for the logic behind the resistance, the formula, the specific advantage, the thing that made them different in a way that could be measured and modeled. I was looking for the wrong thing. The difference is not a weapon or a tactic or a technology. The difference is much simpler. They decided. Once they decided, nothing after that changed it. We do not have a word in our language for a species that makes a decision and then simply does not stop. We may need to make one. The notes spread further, to species that had been under conquered rule for generations, to young civilizations that had been watching quietly from far away, to places where people had learned long ago that the safest thing to do when a large fleet appeared in your sky was to agree to whatever it wanted. Some of those people read the notes twice, then they sat and thought for a while. And in a small market stall in Jeonju, a very old woman who had no idea her granddaughter had just negotiated the most important agreement in human history watched the news on a small screen.